They say the wedding dress is one of the most important items on the big day. For me, it was more than just fabric and lace. It was a connection to the parents I lost at 16. Every detail of that dress told our story. The lace that resembled my mother's gown, the vintage buttons from my father's antique collection. So when Vivian, my future mother-in-law, sent me that casual message saying she had accidentally thrown out my dress along with old items, something inside me shattered, and then turned to steel. "I'm sure you can find another one quickly," she wrote, as if she were talking about a random t-shirt. What Vivian didn't know was that while she was plotting to sabotage my wedding to her son, I was quietly changing the rules of the game. On that wedding morning, as she adjusted her expensive hat and rehearsed her fake smiles, she had no idea that in just a few hours, she would discover that I had become her landlord, and that the power she thought she had over me had completely shifted. This is the story of how I faced a manipulative mother-in-law without becoming like her, how I saved my marriage before it even began, and how I transformed a toxic relationship into something neither of us could have predicted. Should I continue with the next part? It all started 2 years ago when I met Ethan at an architecture exhibition in Chicago. I was presenting my project, which blended sustainable architecture with historical preservation, and he, a literature professor with a passion for old buildings, asked such insightful questions that they caught me off guard. Our eyes met between blueprints and models, and something just clicked. Being an orphan since I was 16, I had always carried the dream of building my own family. When I lost my parents in that car accident, something in me remained incomplete, a void I hoped to fill one day. Ethan, with his caring and thoughtful nature, seemed perfect for that. In the early months of our relationship, he would occasionally mention his widowed mother. "My mom would love to meet you," or "My mom has a very refined taste in art, just like you." Nothing that signaled trouble. In fact, I was eager to meet her. Maybe, I naively thought, we could build the kind of mother-daughter bond I had lost so early. The first meeting with Vivian was a carefully orchestrated disaster. She invited us for dinner at her grand Victorian home in the Chicago suburbs, a property she had inherited from her late husband. I remember being impressed by the elegant facade and architectural details, something I commented on as we entered. "Of course you would notice that," Vivian said with a cold smile. "Architects are always fascinated by appearances, aren't they?" That was just the beginning. Throughout the evening, she made subtly demeaning remarks about me. "Architecture is such an unstable profession these days, isn't it? Especially for women." Or, "You're more robust than Ethan's ex-girlfriends. He always preferred the more delicate type." And the worst, "It must be hard not having a real family to support you in life's important decisions." Ethan, sitting beside me, seemed oblivious to the venom in every sentence. When I brought it up in the car on our way home, he sighed. "She's just being protective. It's been just the two of us since my dad passed away. She'll warm up to you once she gets to know you better." But she didn't. With every visit, Vivian reinforced how close she and Ethan were, how no one could understand his special needs like she did, and how I needed to prove my worth to be accepted into the Bennett family. It felt like she was constantly marking her territory, reminding me that I was the outsider. When Ethan proposed to me after a year of dating, in a perfect moment during a picnic at Millennium Park, my heart nearly exploded with happiness. But a small part of me immediately thought, "And now, Vivian?" I didn't have to wait long for the answer. Upon hearing about the engagement, Vivian escalated her tactics. "You barely know each other," she told Ethan over the phone, loud enough for me to hear from across the room. "Rushed marriages end in painful divorces. Your father and I dated for 5 years before we got married." In the following months, she openly questioned our compatibility, repeatedly suggested that we were rushing things, and tried to control every aspect of the wedding planning. "The Bennett family tradition is to marry at the ancestral home," she insisted, though Ethan later admitted that his parents had actually married in a hotel. Despite Vivian's resistance, Ethan and I decided to move forward with our plans. We chose our wedding date to coincide with the anniversary of our first meeting and began the preparations. That's when the dress became an issue. Since my mother wasn't there to share this special moment, I asked my best friend Becca, a talented fashion designer, to create a custom dress for me. For weeks, we worked together on every detail. Becca incorporated elements that honored my parents, using a lace pattern similar to my mother's wedding dress and sewing vintage buttons from my father's antique collection along the sleeves and back. "Claire, this dress isn't just a dress," Becca said at the final fitting, tears in her eyes. "It's a way for your parents to be present on your big day." Meanwhile, the tension with Vivian escalated when we insisted on having the wedding in a restored historic building downtown instead of her house. "You're rejecting our family traditions," she accused during a particularly tense lunch. "This just shows how much Claire really cares about our family." Ethan, always torn between the two of us, tried to mediate. "Mom, we chose a venue that matches our style and Claire's profession. It's not a rejection of you." In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Vivian's comments became more frequent, questioning my commitment to the real Bennett family and insinuating that I was pulling Ethan away from his roots. "A daughter-in-law who truly loved our family would make an effort to honor our traditions," she would say while stirring her tea with a silver spoon. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, came the seemingly innocent suggestion. "Claire, dear, why don't you store your dress here at my house? It's a family tradition. It brings good luck to the bride." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I hesitated internally but agreed. It was a desperate attempt to build bridges, to show goodwill. Besides, Ethan seemed so relieved by my concession that I couldn't bring myself to refuse. 3 days later, while reviewing the final details of the ceremony with the wedding planner, I received the message that would change everything. "I had a little accident with your dress. I was cleaning and accidentally threw it away with some old items. By the time I realized it, the garbage truck had already passed. I'm sure you can find another one quickly." My blood ran cold. I rushed to her house, my heart pounding in my chest. Vivian greeted me at the door with a perfectly composed expression of false remorse. "What a terrible accident," she repeated as I frantically searched the house. "These things happen." The dress had simply disappeared. No scraps of fabric, no vintage buttons, nothing remained. It was like losing my parents all over again. That tangible connection I had created, the way I planned to have them with me on my wedding day, had vanished. Ethan arrived while I was still there, his eyes red from crying. Torn between loyalty to his mother and outrage over my pain, he tried to mediate the situation. "I'm sure it was really an accident," he said, looking at me with pleading eyes. Vivian stuck to her story, pretending remorse while subtly suggesting that I was overreacting about just a dress. At one point, she even said, "Maybe this is a sign that we should reconsider the date. Wouldn't it be better to postpone?" At that moment, I saw it with crystal clarity. This would never stop. Every birthday, every Christmas, every future child's birth, Vivian would find ways to sabotage, control, and diminish me. Unless something fundamentally changed in our dynamic, I would forever be fighting a losing battle. But instead of a direct confrontation, which would only reinforce her victim narrative, I decided on a different approach. On the way home that night, as Ethan drove in tense silence, an idea started forming in my mind. In the days that followed, while Becca worked frantically to create a new dress, I began executing my plan. For months, I had been researching ways to invest my inheritance, the money I received when I turned 25, left by my parents. Thomas, my mentor and a retired attorney who had become a father figure in my life, always advised me about the security that real estate provides. "Claire," he often said, "land is the one thing they're not making more of. Invest in property." By coincidence or perhaps fate, I learned through Sophia Wright, a real estate agent and a friend of the Bennett family, that Vivian's house was technically for sale. Apparently, her late husband had structured the family's finances in a way that required the house to be sold within 10 years of his death to avoid massive tax and legal complications. That deadline was fast approaching. "She's quietly looking for a buyer who will let her stay as a tenant," Sophia explained over coffee. "Vivian is desperate to maintain appearances. no one in her social circle can know she's no longer the owner of that mansion. I saw the perfect opportunity. Through Thomas, I created a shell company to make the offer, Phoenix Holdings, a name that felt appropriately symbolic. Sophia, well aware of the dress situation and having witnessed Vivian's behavior for years, discreetly helped me navigate the process. I'm not normally vengeful, she admitted. But after what she did to your dress, well, let's just say I'm happy to help. We offered a fair price with extremely favorable terms for Vivian. She could stay as a tenant indefinitely, paying well below market rent, but under a meticulously detailed lease that outlined her responsibilities and limitations as a tenant. Thomas made sure to include specific clauses about respecting others' property and maintaining cordial relationships as conditions for continuing the lease. Vivian, unaware of who was actually buying the property, believing it was just an impersonal investment company, quickly accepted the offer. The papers were signed a week before the wedding, with the official property transfer scheduled, ironically, for the very day of the ceremony. During this time, I kept everything an absolute secret, even from Ethan. I didn't want to put him in an even more difficult position before the wedding, torn between his fiancée and his mother. Plus, I feared he might unintentionally reveal the plan to Vivian. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked when I signed the final papers. "This is a significant investment, and you're mixing business with family matters." I looked at him, unwavering. "This isn't just a financial investment, Thomas. It's an investment in my future, in my marriage. Sometimes to build something new, you have to lay solid foundations." The wedding day finally arrived. Becca had created a new dress in record time, different from the original, but just as meaningful. Instead of trying to replicate what was lost, she designed something that symbolized renewal and strength. "This isn't a replacement dress," she said during the final fitting. "It's a transformation dress." It was more elegant and striking than the original, with a modern cut that blended harmoniously with classic elements. Instead of vintage buttons, Becca had sewn tiny pearls in a pattern that, when viewed up close, formed my parents' initials. On the morning of the wedding, as I got ready in the reserved suite of the historic venue we had chosen, Vivian made a courtesy visit. Something I had fully expected. Her eyes scanned my dress and she delivered her signature cutting remark, feigning surprise. "Oh, you managed to get another dress? It looks appropriate, considering the circumstances, though it doesn't quite have the refinement that the Bennett tradition would require." I simply smiled, feeling a surprising sense of calm. "Thank you for stopping by before the ceremony, Vivian. I have a special gift for you later." She raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but said nothing more before leaving to join the other guests. The ceremony was everything I had ever dreamed of. Thomas walked me down the aisle, discreetly wiping away tears as we made our way forward. Ethan, visibly moved, included a mention of my parents in his vows. "I know that George and Eleanor are here in spirit today, and I promise to honor the love they planted in you." It was after the ceremony, during the reception in the elegant adjoining hall, that the moment I had been planning for weeks finally arrived. After all the toasts and the first speeches were made, I took the microphone for a special announcement. "First of all, I want to thank everyone for sharing this very special day with us," I began, glancing around at the smiling faces. "Family is something I have always deeply valued, and today I'm not just marrying Ethan, I'm joining a new family." My eyes met Vivian's as she sat stiffly at the head table. "I have a special gift for my new family," I continued, reaching into my bag for an envelope. "Vivian, I know how much your house means to you, and I wanted to ensure that you always have a safe home." I walked over to her and handed the envelope to a visibly confused Vivian. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside were the property documents, now under my name, along with the lease agreement she had signed. Her face went through a series of emotions: confusion, then disbelief, followed by gradual comprehension, and finally, a pale shock as she fully grasped what had happened. I leaned in slightly and said, low enough for only her to hear, "As your new landlord, I want to make sure we have a relationship based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. Just as you accidentally discarded something precious to me, I could just as easily accidentally raise your rent or find violations in the lease. But unlike you, I intend to honor our agreements and treat others' possessions with respect. The room fell into an odd silence, with everyone sensing that something significant was happening, though few understood exactly what. Vivian's expression was frozen in a mask of shock, the envelope clutched tightly in her hands. Ethan, standing beside me, looked back and forth between me and his mother, clearly confused. I could see the exact moment when he put the pieces together. The accidental conversations he had overheard about real estate investments, my secretive meetings with Thomas, the perfectly timed execution. His eyes widened, then narrowed into an expression that was a mix of surprise and, was it admiration? Before the situation could escalate or ruin the celebration, I raised my glass again and concluded for everyone present. But today is not a day for business. It's a day for new beginnings, new families, and new bonds. Ethan and I are building our life on honesty and respect, and we hope that everyone here will be part of this journey. The toast resumed, the music started again, and the party continued. But something fundamental had changed in that room, and in Vivian Bennett's eyes. The days following the wedding were tumultuous, just as I had predicted. After our brief honeymoon, a weekend in a lakeside cabin by Lake Michigan, we returned to face the consequences of my revelation. Ethan, though initially shocked by my secret plan, surprised me with his reaction. After a long night of conversation, in our new apartment, he admitted feeling relieved that someone had finally set clear boundaries with his mother. I grew up watching my father give in to her every whim just to keep the peace, he confessed, holding my hands. After he died, I took on the same role. I was so used to being the mediator that I didn't realize how toxic it was. He paused, his eyes glistening with restrained tears. What you did with the dress, when I got that message from her, I knew she had crossed a line, but I didn't know how to confront her. We had long, much-needed conversations about loyalty, family, and how to balance our relationships. Ethan revealed how he had always felt trapped between the two of us, unable to challenge his mother's manipulative behavior for fear of losing her, especially after his father's death. It's like she built her entire identity around being Ethan's mother and Bennett's widow, he explained. When I started a serious relationship, I think she saw it as a threat to the most fundamental part of who she is. Meanwhile, Vivian cycled through a predictable range of emotions. First came the anger, furious phone calls to Ethan, accusing me of manipulation and betrayal. Then, attempts at victimization. I never imagined my own son would allow me to be deceived like this. When that didn't work, she tried to turn Ethan against me, questioning my motives and suggesting I was only interested in the Bennett family's wealth. Finally, after about a week of drama, we received a surprisingly formal email. I would like to discuss the terms of continuing our family and real estate relationship. Can we meet on Thursday at 2 p.m.? The meeting took place at Vivian's house, or rather, at my house where Vivian lived. Ethan insisted on being present, not as a mediator this time, but as an equal participant in the conversation. I suppose I should congratulate you on your cunning, were Vivian's first words as she greeted us with tea served in her finest china. I didn't think you had that kind of determination. I didn't do this to be cunning, Vivian, I responded calmly. I did this to establish balance in our relationship. The conversation was tense but surprisingly productive. For the first time, Vivian treated me not as a temporary intruder in her son's life, but as a force to be reckoned with. I made it clear that I wouldn't use the house as a weapon against her, but that I expected civilized behavior in return. The lease will remain exactly as it is, favorable and below market value, as long as you respect our boundaries, I explained. That includes not interfering in our decisions as a couple and treating our possessions with the same respect you expect for yours. Then came the most surprising moment of the afternoon. After a long silence, Vivian delicately placed her teacup on the saucer and looked directly at me, perhaps for the first time without a filter of hostility. I deliberately destroyed your dress, she admitted, her voice low but firm. I thought it might delay or even cancel the wedding. It was unforgivable. I felt Ethan tense beside me, but I placed my hand over his, silently asking him to let his mother continue. Ever since Harold died, I've been living in fear, she continued, gazing out the window at the garden her late husband had designed. Fear of being replaced, forgotten. This wedding, she gestured vaguely in our direction, symbolized for me not just losing control over Ethan, but also the last connection to my past life, to who I was. It was a rare moment of genuine vulnerability, a glimpse of the woman behind the perfectly controlled facade. For an instant, I saw not the manipulative Vivian, but a frightened widow struggling to hold on to the fragments of her identity. I understand the fear of losing connections to the past, I replied, thinking of my own parents. But destroying future bonds doesn't preserve the old ones. It only leaves us more alone. The following months brought gradual changes neither of us could have predicted. Vivian, confronted with the real consequences of her actions, and without her usual emotional manipulation tactics to rely on, began making a genuine effort. At first, they were small gestures, a dinner invitation without passive-aggressive remarks, a sincere question about my work, a compliment not followed by a veiled critique. Later, she surprised us by mentioning that she had started therapy, something Ethan had suggested for years. Her therapist must be very persuasive, I commented to Ethan after we heard the news. Actually, he smiled, I think you are. About 3 months after the wedding, Vivian approached me with an unexpected proposal. I've been thinking about transforming that old guest room upstairs, she explained almost timidly. I've always wanted a space to paint. Before I met Harold, I studied art, you know? I gave it up when we got married. An art studio would be perfect for that space, I responded, genuinely excited by the idea. The natural light from the north-facing window is ideal for painting. As a gesture of goodwill, and applying my professional skills to a personal context, I designed a small renovation to create a studio adjacent to the bedroom. We worked together on selecting colors, lighting, and storage. It was the first time we had collaborated on anything, and to my surprise, I discovered that Vivian had an excellent eye for design when she wasn't preoccupied with trying to control everything and everyone around her. That space became symbolically important. It was hers, a haven to rediscover parts of herself that had been stifled by decades of an identity built solely around her husband and son. But it existed within a larger structure that belonged to our new family dynamic. Meanwhile, Ethan thrived in the freedom of not having to constantly mediate conflicts. He received a promotion at the university, started working on the book he had always postponed, and our relationship deepened in ways we hadn't imagined possible. It's like I can finally breathe fully, he commented one night. A year after the wedding, when we found out we were expecting our first child, I faced the announcement to Vivian with some apprehension. Historically, anything that could steal even more of Ethan's attention had been met with resistance. We invited Vivian over for dinner and shared the news about the grandchild on the way. Her reaction surprised all of us, including herself. I believe, instead of jealousy or attempts at control, her eyes welled up with genuine tears. You two will be wonderful parents, she said simply, squeezing our hands. A week later, she called us over to her house. I would always struggle to think of it as my property, and led us into her studio. There, on the easel, was a hand-painted portrait of my parents, based on an old wedding photo I had shared months earlier. I thought your child should know all their grandparents, Vivian explained, her voice slightly trembling. Even the ones they can only meet through stories. It was a profound acknowledgement that my original family was important too, that our child would be part of a bigger story that included all of our histories. In her own way, it was a peace offering more meaningful than any words could express. Sometimes when I look out the window of our new home, a restoration project that perfectly blends my passion for architecture with Ethan's passion for history, I see our 2-year-old playing in the garden under the watchful eye of his grandmother. Vivian teaches him the names of the flowers, while he repeats them in his toddler's voice. Family relationships are complex, and sometimes require unconventional measures. What began as a defensive maneuver to set boundaries turned into an opportunity for growth for all of us. My mother-in-law destroyed my wedding dress, believing she could control our future. On the wedding day, she discovered that I was her new landlady, not to punish her, but to establish a new balance between us. The lost dress taught me that some things can't be replaced, but they can be transformed into something new and even more valuable: mutual respect. In that Victorian house that now belongs to me on paper but will always be Vivian's home, we learned a lesson that no contract could define. Real families aren't built on rigid traditions or control, but on the willingness to change, grow, and sometimes start over entirely. And as for that second dress Becca made, it's carefully preserved in my closet, not as a reminder of Vivian's cruelty, but as a symbol that sometimes what rises from the ashes of destruction is stronger and more beautiful than what existed before.